Hey guys, thanks so much for stopping by. My name is Galen and I'm an evangelist for Quixel at Epic Games. Today we're going to be looking at an environment that I threw together pretty quickly using Quixel Mixer and Unreal Engine. Today we're going to be doing an in-depth look at Quixel Mixer, and I'm going to be using a couple different asset types in order to achieve our final result that you're seeing here on screen. And in case you don't already know, everything that we're going to be covering today is entirely free for you to use. Quixel Mixer and the entire Megascans library are entirely free for Unreal Engine users. Alright, and without any further delay, let's get started. Alright, so let's get started here inside of Quixel Mixer, and I'm going to start by creating the sand that you're seeing as the base for most of what's in the environment. To start that, what I'm going to do is just simply search sand into the library and see what I have locally already. And I already have this Thai beach scan that's actually perfect for our purposes here. And I want to make some really simple manipulations to this before we move on. And what I'm going to do to start is actually up the low frequency values, because I really like what some of the larger shapes are actually doing here when we actually increase that intensity. And the next thing that I like to do is actually bring in maybe some footprints into this so that maybe it looks like a character has maybe walked across the sand and water started to pool up where the footprints are. I'm going to achieve this look by actually bringing in this snow material. And what I really like about this material here is that we're actually getting some nice footprints that we can bring in and maybe just isolate those individual components for the sand material here below. So as you can see here, I just moved it up to the top of the stack. You can actually see what's going on. But if I remove some of the high frequency values here, it kind of smooths out this surface a little bit, and it'll be perfect for isolating some of those larger trenches and footmarks. And if I bring my sand actually to the top of the stack now, we can start to manipulate some of the parameters here to make the sand actually play a little bit better with the snow. And the first thing that I'm going to do here is actually play around with some of the values with wrap underline and blurring some of the underlying elements, just to see how these two materials actually react when they're set on top of each other. Now, as you can see, as I start to move the wrap to underline, we actually get sort of an average of the two so that we're getting the best of both of these different materials. And I think we actually get something kind of nice right in this range. And as you can see, as we start to play with the blur underline a little bit, we can start to reveal a little bit more of the soft features from the snow material down below. And this is exactly what I'm going for, in that I want the sand to have lots of elements that are still very soft in nature, maybe like they're a little bit windswept. But then we're going to add in some finer details and maybe some higher frequency values here for the next bit. And what I really like about this material specifically is that we're actually getting some really nice high frequency values in this scan. And I'm going to see if I can't isolate some of those features and get the best of both the soft elements of what we've already created and maybe some of the harsher, more kind of piled up areas that are a little bit more sharp in nature. Now, as you can see, I'm wrapping this specifically to the underlying mix already. And from there, what I'm going to do is just to feather the radius a little bit so that we get maybe a little bit less or more of what it is that I like from the scan. And then once again, using the threshold to bring up a little bit more or less of the actual material that we need. So I like this result a lot, but what I'm going to do now is actually bring a sand actor once again by duplicating, hitting Control D on the keyboard and bringing that sand material back to the top of the stack. Now, just like in Photoshop, you can actually append a certain layer in Mixer to one of the elements down below. And to do that, all I'm going to do is Alt-click on the Thai beach scan that we've actually brought in here and append that directly to the dirt layer that we just brought in below. Another really cool material type that we have in the library is our Atlas library. And for this specific example, what I'd like to do is actually bring in some pebbles that might have washed into some of the larger footprints that we've got for our material. And our atlases are obviously a different asset type in that they actually have opacity attached to them. And as we've just isolated the albedo channel here, you can see that we have these really nice pebbles that are just sitting on the top. Now, just to reinforce the point that I was just making about how Mixer's always tiling, I'll just manipulate X and Y on this material so you can see just what happens in the viewport as we start to slide this material around. A lot of the atlases in the library specifically have this tiling feature with them, which is really nice for just sprinkling on the top of a surface just like this one. And the first thing I'm going to do is actually manipulate the albedo here slightly so that we get the color into a range that I think fits a little bit better for our purposes. Now, there's a couple different ways that you can manipulate color, and I'm going to start here by middle clicking on the color swatch. And what that actually does is it creates an average of all the colors from the mix down below. And just like that, we have these pebbles actually blending in much better with the surface, as you can see. And another way to do this is actually by using the eyedropper tool. And when you select that color swatch, you can drag into the viewport here and actually select any range of colors that you can see inside of your project. And as always, you can use the color picker if you would like, or punch in hex values to get the desired result. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is actually change the blending mode to where we actually get these pebbles to blend from below. Now, as you can see, as we start to feather the threshold of this, you can see that the pebbles are now only coming through in those recessed areas. And I really like this result because it gives us a little bit of visual rest on the surface where we have elements of the material that are very, very devoid of detail and then some that are very rich down below. And since our subject is a beach here, why don't we add in a little bit of noise onto the surface to where we can actually get a little bit of undulation that might be present in an area like this specifically. And again, this is always tiling, but as you can see, I'm just adjusting the frequency and maybe the amplitude a little bit to try to get something that I think is a little bit more in line with the reference that I've pulled for this environment. And I think I'm pretty happy with this result here. So I think the last thing we need to do is just bring in some simple puddles into the mix. And if I just click the liquid button here at the top of the UI, I can bring in this liquid actor, which will add in some really nice puddles for this mix. Now, I'm pretty happy with the end result here, just as is, but it's important to note that you can go in and start to affect maybe the threshold of the moisture, maybe make the moisture look a little bit deeper, or blur the effect in the sliders on the side here. All right, and I think I'm pretty happy with this mix as is here, so why don't we go ahead and save our project really quick, and the next thing that I would like to do is actually add this to the library. Now, there's several ways you can go about exporting out of Mixer, but this is my method of choice whenever I'm bringing an asset into Unreal Engine. Whenever I click the Export to Library button, what this is doing is in a non-destructive way, it's bringing in all of the information that we just created in this mix, and we can actually scale this to go up and down in resolution from export out of Bridge, or we can customize it even further with some channel packing, either here in the Mixer UI or in Bridge when we get over there. Now, since I know I don't have any metalness or specular that I need for this project specifically, I'm going to uncheck those and just click export. And we'll put a pin in this, but we'll come back to it here in a second when we actually jump over to Bridge. And now the other important actor that we want to start to work on is the chest that's in the center of the environment here. Now, one of the big updates that we've made to Quixel Mixer 2020 is that we've actually added in 3D support. Now, what this allows you to do is not only leverage the entire Megascans library to retexture and repurpose assets, but you can also bring in custom assets if you would like. Now, to start, I'm just going to browse over to my local library and find the small wooden chest actor here from the library. And I really liked this actor a lot because I thought that I could maybe make some very simple manipulations to it and actually tell a pretty convincing story just on this small little beach scene. Now, to make it feel a little bit more weathered and part of this world, I think what I'd like to do is start to make some really simple manipulations in order to actually get this to seem like it's actually been sitting on the beach for a long time. Maybe it's accumulated some barnacles and some moss buildup. So why don't we start now by actually going up to adding in a surface. And if I go into start here, what I'll bring in is actually that exact same sand material that we were just working with on our surface mix. And what I'd like to start with is actually just maybe bringing some of this sand into some of the cracks and crevices of this object, as if it's been windblown or maybe sitting on the beach for a long time. Now, in projecting these materials onto the surface, what I'd like to do is actually leverage the hexaplanar projection, which is brand new inside of Mixer 2020. And by selecting box projection, I have a couple different things that I can do to manipulate this material and get it into the range that I'm looking for this project. Now, I really want this effect to be rather understated, so I only want the sand to be maybe collecting in some of the cracks and crevices of this object. So after I brought in the sand, I can right click on that material and actually add in a mask component. And we're going to be selecting curvature for this example because the live curvature component in Mixer is really powerful. Now, you're given a couple of different options if you want to use default curvature or use some of the presets down below, like edges only or cavities. But why don't we start to mess around with this and just generally see if we can bring it into the range that I'm looking for. The levels adjustments is really important here for dialing in the result. And then I can actually go in and affect the tightness of this as well. Now, there's also anti-aliasing and soft mesh options here down below, or I can invert the effect as well. But what this does is really just allow you to customize the experience even further. Now, I really like the way this anti-aliasing actually looks on the surface because it kind of de-speckles the curvature a little bit, and it makes it just feel a little bit more natural on the surface. And like I mentioned, we can go back up to maybe default curvature and start to maybe just adjust the levels and the tightness to get a custom result here just by using the default settings. Now I think this is looking pretty good, but as you can see, we're getting a very uniform result across this entire surface. So why don't we actually bring in a map to actually go in and break this up a little bit. So I'll go up to the top of my stack and add in a map component to this specific stack. Now what's really nice about this is that I can use this map to actually break up the effects from down below, and we have blending modes on top of that that will allow us to really customize this. So I want to leverage another component of the library in the imperfections section, and if I go over to my local library and actually just isolate the imperfections tab, you can see that we have a wide variety of different imperfection maps that are perfect for what it is I'm trying to do. And these imperfections can do a wide variety of different things for your mix, but what I'm going to be doing here is actually just using it to break up the sand a little bit and then multiplying the effect on top of the stack down below. Now, as you can see, we get this, and I'll just toggle it on and off so you can see exactly what the result does, but I think that we've got something that feels a little bit more natural than what we had before. Let's continue to weather the surface a little bit more, and like we touched on in the last part, we can actually go into our Atlas section here and find some really interesting components for this mix specifically. I'd really like a nice buildup of some lichens or moss, and then actually bring in some barnacles here as well. So let's start with the moss, and what I'll do is actually just apply this directly to our project and see the result. Now, once again, we can project this in a couple different ways, but I'm going to stick with the hexaplanar projection to make sure that we tackle some of our seams problems here, and just start to maybe move it around a little bit with our wheel and start to actually manipulate the surface a little bit more. And like we touched on before, I'm going to be using hexaplanar projection specifically with this example because I really want to cover up the seams with the effect. And the last thing I'm going to do here is actually just make it so that we project exactly the details that I want on the surface, exactly where I want them with this wheel. And once again, I don't want this to be a completely uniform effect. So what I'm going to do is actually add in a position gradient now into my mask stack. And the reason for this is because I kind of like the lichens to not be on the top side of the surface, because it seems like you would probably only get this type of effect in an area that might be covered in shade or an area that's getting a lot less sunshine. So why don't we start over here with the position gradient, and as you can see, as we start to feather the range a little bit, we can get that effect to start to have a really nice creep up the side of the surface. And then going back into the material properties here, I can actually start to mess around with whether or not the effect is going to blur the details down below. And I think that what we can do is actually turn that all the way up so that we actually get this lichen to actually seem like it's really coming off the surface a little bit more. And the next thing I'd like to add in, like I mentioned at the beginning, are some barnacles. I think the barnacles are going to give us a really nice aged look to this, and it's just going to break up the surface a little bit more than what we have right now. And what's really cool about this is that when you start to mess around with the frequency values of these different materials, you might really surprise yourself with what you're actually going to get in the way that these materials start to react to one another. And the next thing that I'd like to do is actually mask out a little bit of the barnacles on the front side of the box. And the reason for that is because I got some feedback from one of my colleagues about how the barnacles on the front side of the box were actually just a little bit too distracting when I sent him an early version of this scene. So by just adding in this normal component to the side here, what I can do is actually use a specific axis to mask out the effect. And once again, manipulating the range and the middle section of the wheel actually gives you a very different effect. So definitely start to mess around with those different parameters until you get something that you think you really like. All right, so I'm pretty happy with how the barnacles turned out here. So I think what I'm going to do is actually go back to the moss, and what I'd like to do is break up the effect a little bit more than what we've done already. And to start, what I'm going to do is actually just duplicate this layer by hitting Control D on the keyboard. And by duplicating it here, we actually carry over all the different parameters and the information that we stored inside of the stack, as well as the material itself. So we don't have to go back through and punch all those values back in again. Now, what I'd like to do is actually just change a couple basic parameters here so that we get the moss to project a little bit differently on the surface with a different albedo. And what this does is actually creates a little bit of separation between the two moss materials that we have on the surface. And because we have 3D painting in the viewport here, what we'll do is actually go in and start to mask out the areas where I actually don't like the effect at all. And this is really easy to add in just by right-clicking on any material you have in your project and selecting the paint mask component. And the paint mask actually integrates with your stack, but isn't a part of the stack necessarily. So as you can see here, I'm going to start to paint out the effect a little bit of that moss in the areas where I just didn't like it simply in the projection. All right, and I think I'm pretty happy with this box. So why don't we move on to the next asset? All right, so let's move on to creating the rocks for this scene. And just to keep everything consistent, I'm going to actually pull another asset from the Thailand scan trip in these rocks that you're seeing here. So what I'm going to do to start is actually bring in, once again, that position gradient component that we were looking at in the last example. And what I want is for the sands to just be creeping up the sides of these rocks and really just kind of fall onto the skirt, and then in some of the areas where we're actually getting some recesses and crevices in the rock. And also cover the skirt as best as we can so that it actually integrates a lot better with the component of the sand mix that we made earlier. And the next thing I'm going to do is actually bring in some procedural noise, because I think the effect is good as it currently exists, but I want to break up that mask a little bit more so we get a little bit more of a natural transition with the sand. Now there's two issues that pop up immediately when we start to look at this Perlin noise actor in our scene. So what I'm going to do here to start is actually try to get this noise to interact with the position gradient that we have in the stack elements below. And to do that, what I'm going to do is actually just use an overlay blend mode so that we get the position gradient as well as the noise from what we just created. And the second problem that you'll see when we brought this Perlin noise component into our scene is that we're actually not getting this to tile. And one of the ways you can actually combat this is if you bring in a projection component into our stack and we append it just to that noise. So I think this is looking really good so far, but I think we can push it even further by actually bringing in another curvature component here and actually just having the sand adhere to the cracks and crevices of this rock now. So as you can see, now what we're getting is a really nice soft transition of the sand creeping up the side of the rock and adhering to some of the cracks and crevices in the rock surface. And of course, this is entirely non-destructive, so at any time we can go back in and start to maybe adjust how far that sand creeps up the side of the rock, or maybe go in and start to affect the frequency of the noise on the surface. So there's two more things I want to add into this mix specifically. So what I'll do is actually go up to, once again, the Atlas section of the library, and I'm going to bring in two different elements that I think will really tie this thing together. Now I'm going to start with that exact same pebbles material that we were working with on the surface mix, because I want that to stay consistent from what we had on the first mix in the terrain, and actually bringing that same effect here on the rock, so that when we start to actually jam this rock into the surface, that we have similar components that maybe make this integrate just a little bit more into our scene. So once again, I'm going to be using a position gradient so that we only get the rocks to adhere just to that skirt element here. And I'm going to adjust the color a little bit here so that we get something that's a little bit more natural for our mix. And I think this is looking pretty good. Now there's one other thing I want to add into this mix, and I think it'd be really cool if we had some seaweed that maybe gotten caught in some of the rocks here on the side. So what I'll do is I'll go back up to my Atlas tab and bring in a seaweed actor here where we can actually start to scatter this effect on top of the surface. Now this is kind of a low-tech solution, but if I change the projection method to tiling, what will happen is that since all the different UV shells are actually rotated in their own way in 0 to 1 space, what will happen is that this effect of putting this atlas on the surface will make it seem like it's randomized or rotated across the surface when we actually start to repeat this effect several times. Now, as you can see, we're starting to get seaweed to now project across the surface in a pretty cool way. And if I start to manipulate this in X and Y, we can start to actually get the effect to be exactly where we want it to be projected on the surface. Now, this is looking pretty cool, but as you can see, once I change it to blend from below, we can actually get some lost and found lines with this, which just really makes it that much more convincing in the mix. And just because we can, why don't we go in and start to paint out some of the areas where the seams are very present with this. So I'll go into this area specifically and paint out where I'm seeing those two different pieces of seaweed maybe just intersect at a seam in an unfortunate way. And just like that, we've got seaweed tiling across our surface and it's looking really, really cool. So why don't I go ahead and save my project and then we'll move on to the next element. All right, so let's do one last mix here before we jump into the engine. And what I'm going to do to start here is actually bring in this coin. And what I'd like is actually to scatter this coin across the surface of the sand, because adding in some 3D scatter actually will just create even more unique shadows and just break up the surface even more. So why don't we start by just bringing it into Mixer, and I'm going to use gold as my starting place. Now, as you can see, the gold itself is just a little bit too strong, a little bit too clean for what we're doing here. So what I'm going to do is actually, first of all, break up the roughness by bringing in another imperfection and just overlaying that in the roughness channel. Now, this is obviously a very subtle effect, but I think it's enough to break up the surface here for us. And now I'm going to bring in a dust and dirt texture, which I think would be really, really nice just to break up the gold a little bit. So I'll bring in this sand debris material. Now, after I adjust the scale on this, what I'm going to do is just bring it into the range that I need it to be for the albedo, and then use a curvature mask component to mask the effect a little bit. Now, as you can see, this dirt really breaks up the surface in a nice way. And what I really like about this is that we're able to maybe put some sand or dirt here in the areas where it might be collecting on this, but it's also kind of dulling the effect of the very, very shiny gold. So it's kind of getting both of those effects for us in one. So once again, this is just a really simple mix, but I think it's good enough for a ground scatter element. Now, one thing I want to point out here before we move on is that there are a couple different ways to export out of Mixer. And like we did with our surface, you can go File and Add to Library for a surface mix. And then if you need to export anything that's going to be related to a 3D object, you go to our Export tab here on the side. And this will actually allow you to channel pack and customize the export experience fully. I do want to point out that we are actively working to have an add to library component for 3D elements, but as of the recording of this video, that feature is not currently represented. So for all of those 3D mixes that we just did, I'm going to go ahead and export those just as JPEGs into my scene. But for now, I'm going to jump over to Bridge, and I want to show you the surface mix that we made at the very beginning of the tutorial. If I go to my local tab and I browse down to Mixer, you can see here on the side that we have the sandy feet mix that we were just working on. And I can isolate my different maps here on the side, or I can go into my 3D viewer and actually preview the material here live inside of Bridge. And again, what's really nice about this is that this is a completely non-destructive workflow, and that I can actually export this at whatever resolution I like out of Bridge, channel pack it, and really customize the experience exactly for what my project needs. So as you can see, with just a single click, I was able to get that material that I created in Mixer and export it from Bridge with the material already set up in my scene. And let's just inspect the master material here real quick so you can see just how simple this material really is. So one of the things I like to point out here before we move on is that if you're using a custom master material for your project, you can actually have the plugin point to that master material so that a material instance gets created from that master material as opposed to the standard master material that ships with Bridge. We know that every project has its own needs, so we wanted to make the tool as flexible as possible for artists. So as you can see on the side of my details tab, I have a really simple setup for this scene. And I brought in the new sky and atmosphere systems and a couple lights so that we can start to build our scene directly from this setup. So to start, I've already dragged on the material here to our ground actor. And from here, let's start to actually make some manipulations to this material instance so that we can start to get that landscape looking exactly the way we want it in the viewport. You can do some really simple modifications with this material, like affecting the tiling for the material, or maybe making a simple adjustment to the albedo, maybe tint it in a specific way, or feather the roughness a little bit to where you get all the reflections to be exactly the way you want them in your scene. And I'm also adjusting the normal intensity to be a little bit higher than 1 because I want some of those crispy details to come out from the mix that we created. And since we exported with displacement for this specific mix, I'm going to start to actually change the tessellation values and affect the displacement strength until we get something that we really like in the view. We've made it here as well, so where you can actually adjust the amount of tessellation, be it near or far to the camera, which is just a really nice feature for optimization. So now that we've got a really solid foundation to build on, why don't we start to bring in some of the 3D elements that we were just mixing into our scene. And let's start with our rocks here. So what I'm going to do is actually bring in LOD 0 as the render mesh, but also have a couple different LODs in my scene here just to make sure that we're staying performant. So now as you can see, with just a single click, we were able to bring in this actor and start to set dress our scene with exactly what it was that we were just mixing. And just for the sake of expediency, I've also exported the material from Mixer so that we get the updates to the mix for this specific rock. And like we touched on at the very beginning of the video, I really wanted the integration from this rock to the sand to actually be a little bit more custom. So I've added in a really simple dither setup to this so that we actually get a little bit of a blend from that rock down into the terrain actor. So this is the math that plugs directly into pixel depth offset. It's nothing fancy, but I think it'll get the job done for what we're doing. And as you can see here, we're getting a really nice transition there where we're getting some of the sand from the mix playing really, really nice with what we're getting with the sand and the rock. And now I'm just going to be doing a little bit of set dressing here to try to get something compelling in the frame. So I'll start to duplicate these guys and rotate them around and try to find something compelling. And let's go ahead and bring in our box now. And this is kind of our hero actor for this scene. So why don't we place it a little bit off to the side here, maybe just the right side of the frame. And we'll offset it a little bit so it seems like it might be sitting in that sand a little bit. So one thing that I added to the shader just because I wanted a little bit more flexibility was actually adding in a desaturation feature into the shader. And this isn't anything too fancy. All I'm really doing is bringing in just a simple desaturation node and multiplying that with a constant so that when I'm in my material instance, then I can actually affect that a little bit more or less depending on what it is I'm trying to get. So I want to do a little bit more set dressing here as well because I want to break up some of the horizontal lines and maybe make some more elements that just kind of sit in the sand, make it feel a little bit more grounded. So as you can see, I'm just cloning this guy, rotating it slightly, trying to find some compelling angles for it. And what this does is it really just sort of breaks up the surface even more from what we had. And I'm specifically doing this because of some feedback that I received from one of my colleagues that breaking up some of the lines in this scene would actually go a long way to make it feel that much more organic. I also wanted a little bit of movement in the scene, so I brought in some palm fronds that are just going to be moving slightly in the background. But let's go ahead and move into our last step of this scene here too, where I'm going to start to scatter in some of the elements that we had in Mixer. So the two pieces that I want to scatter in this scene are this coin that we mixed that's kind of a nice gold coin and also this little pebble. And I wanted to bring these guys in as actual 3D objects to scatter on the surface because I thought it would just look a little bit better than relying on the displacement to actually create some of these shapes. And as you can see, as I just start to sprinkle in these gold coins and some of these pebbles, it just makes it feel a little bit more grounded than what we had before. And just sprinkling in these coins adds in a little bit of a narrative component, which I really like. So I'm going to go ahead and scatter a little bit of those into our scene. But I think that'll about tie it up for this environment. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you have any questions or comments, definitely feel free to leave them down below. And if you haven't already, definitely make sure to check out some of the other videos that are coming out of Unreal Fest here on the Unreal Engine YouTube channel. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.